Have you made the switch to Knix? Millions of women have made the switch to the revolutionary period underwear from Knix. That's Knix. Period panties from Knix are like no other, making them the #1 leak-proof underwear brand in North America. They're comfy, stylish, and absorbent, perfect for period protection from your lightest to your heaviest days. They look, feel, and machine wash just like regular underwear, but feature incognito protection that has you covered. You can shop sizes from extra small to 4XL. Choose from all kinds of colors, prints, and different styles, from bikinis to boy shorts, thongs to high-rise. You've got to try Knix. See why millions are ditching disposable, wasteful period products and have switched to Knix. Go to knix.com and get 15% off with promo code TRY15. That's knix.com, promo code TRY15 for 15% off life-changing period underwear. That's knix.com.
Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Kemper Donovan.
I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And in this episode, we will be covering Ordeal by Innocence. We have been looking forward to this one for quite some time. This is one of the higher profile of the latter-day Christie novels. We had many expectations. We have many thoughts. But before we jump into those, we should note up top that our next two episodes after this one are very special and very exciting ones.
Interviews.
We are thrilled to announce that we conducted an interview recently with the outstanding, the stupendous, the insert superlative of your choice here, contemporary mystery author Tana French, whose latest novel, The Searcher, is not so much a mystery as it is a modern Western, but honestly, that is okay. We will forgive her that because it is a brilliant novel.
There is a mystery, of course, because it's Tana French, but it is, Western inspired, and we both just thought it was wonderful and that she was a wonderful guest.
Oh my God, yeah. You know, we spoke with her about The Searcher and her Dublin Murder Squad series and so much more. We managed to have a spoiler-free conversation, so if you haven't read The Searcher yet, don't worry. Although we would urge you to get on that because it is as beautifully written as everything that Tana writes. So that conversation will be coming to you in our next episode. And then after that, we had the joy of sitting down once again with our longtime friend of the podcast, Dr. Mark Aldridge, who has a new book out. It's called Agatha Christie's Poirot, the Greatest Detective in the World. We were able to get our hot little hands on an advance copy, and the book is just gorgeous. The hardcover version is already out in the UK, and it's coming out in early 2021 in the US. It's got a ton of cover art and illustrations in it. Basically, Mark goes into every single Poirot novel and Poirot short story, and then every single adaptation of those novels and short stories in his usual comprehensive, encyclopedic way, which we've come to know and love via his first book, Agatha Christie on Screen. And we just wanted to let you know about that up front rather than leaving it for the sign-off. So now let's go ahead and dive headfirst into the current topic at hand. Catherine Brobeck, can you tell us a little bit about the publication history of Ordeal by Innocence?
Yeah, it was first published in book form by Collins Crime in the UK on November 3rd, 1958, by Dodd Mead in the US in 1959, but it was published in the UK in serial form over 2 installments, abridged, clearly, in September of 1958 in John Bull.
There still must have been really long installments in periodical.
Oh, for sure. And then it was, the interwebs suggest that it was published in 36 parts in February and March of 1959 in the Chicago Tribune under the title The Innocent, which actually seems more reasonable in all honesty, but still, that's a segment a day.
Yeah, those are rather shorter installments. That's interesting if they were published on both ends of the spectrum in terms of length of installment like that in the US and the UK. I actually have a little bit of extra information too, just on that title. This is another one of those titles of Christie's that went through some workshopping. Not really workshopping, but there were a number of suggested alternate titles because The Innocent, which is how it was published in serial form in the US, that was the working title for the book because the reader report from Collins references it as, quote unquote, the innocent, which makes sense. There's a big focus on the innocent in this book, as there so often is in Christie. But that same reader had reservations about that title and suggested the following: Viper's Point, A Serpent's Tooth, The Burden of Innocence, and, drumroll please, Cat Among the Pigeons, which is really funny because that would go on to be, of course, her next title, the published novel, Cat Among the Pigeons. Maybe it got to Christie and then it kind of stuck in her ear, so that's where she went for her next novel. But we've seen this before, like a little bit of crossover in terms of the titles. I think Ordeal by Innocence, though, is a fine title. I like it.
It is, although it's really funny that Cat Among the Pigeons comes up because at various points in the book, it almost seems like somebody's going to say that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Because
I do.
There are many of bird references in it, and then there are all sorts of references to cats.
Yes.
And so I kept having this whole thing where I was like, is somebody just going to say there's a cat amongst the pigeons here?
No, it's true. That's a really good point. I also have a little extra tidbit on the publishing history, which is coming from Janet Morgan, as it so often does. Apparently, the idea for this book came from Stella Kirwan, who was a secretary of sorts for Agatha Christie. She kept her typing and her letters in order. And she had drawn Christie's attention to the story of an Antarctic explorer who had recently been telling newspapers about the strangeness of returning home after months without news. And Agatha apparently brooded over this. And then in October of 1957, so a full year before the book was published, she sent her longtime agent Edmund Cork a note saying, "I want to know from one of our barrister or solicitor advisors what would happen in a case as follows." And then she laid out the premise of the novel with Arthur Calgary being away on this Antarctic expedition and whatnot. And she finished it up with, "A word as to this as soon as possible would help me to get to work industriously." So apparently she got her answer on that and went right to work. And the Christie for Christmas, poof, appeared, and we have Ordeal by Innocence. I suppose we should get into the substance of the story here by talking first about our victim.
We shall, and that would be Mrs. Rachel Argyle, who was an heiress, Anglo-American heiress, which we get on occasion, right? She has an intense passion for the welfare of children, especially children in vulnerable situations. And we find out that she's been murdered 2 years prior to the start of the novel, ostensibly by her son, Jacko, with a poker to the skull. You know, she bashed her over the head. And her son is convicted for the murder and dies in prison of pneumonia.
We also will have some subsequent victims, but we'll get into that as we're breaking down the plot of the story. So in terms of suspects, well, we have a pretty obvious primary suspect here. That would be Jacko, who, as Catherine mentioned, is already dead by the start of the novel. He was a wild child who couldn't be controlled by the family, and he was heard getting into a screaming altercation with Rachel the evening of her death. Jacko, however, insisted that he had an alibi for the murder, that he had been picked up hitchhiking back to town during the very, I might even say, suspiciously specific time frame.
Between 7 and 7:30.
Yeah, it's a half hour. He said that he was hitchhiking during that entire time, but no one, unfortunately, ever came forward to verify that information. So Jacko was convicted and sent to prison for life, at which point he contracted pneumonia and died, as Catherine said.
Again, somebody has already been convicted for this crime. But let's just say that we would not have a book if there weren't other suspects. So we have Leo Argyle, who's Rachel's, he was an economist, he's an academic, he is like very intelligent and seemingly like a nice man. And it seems like they shared a relatively pleasant life together.
Rather anodyne. That would be the word I would use for the textual Leo. Not in any of the adaptations, but Leo in the text is rather anodyne. Then we have Gwenda Vaughn, who is Leo's secretary, who is attractive and intelligent. There seems to be a pretty clear attraction between Gwenda and Leo, and they seem to be on the brink of getting married.
So then we have Mary Durant, formerly Mary Argyle. She's the oldest daughter of the Argyle family, and she is this very tightly wound, sort of at the same time, ditzy is not the right word, but a little bit spaced out, like she doesn't seem to get things particularly. And she's a homemaker whose primary purpose seems to be overseeing the dusting of the brass and taking care of her husband.
That would be Philip Durant, who had been a pilot in World War II, but unfortunately he caught polio after the war, and he has lost the use of his legs. So he is confined to a wheelchair for the duration of the novel, and he is very smart and very bored.
Right. And then we have Mickey Argyle, Michael. He's a slightly ne'er-do-well son as well, but he's no Jacko. He's handsome, but he hasn't quite lived up to his potential. So currently he's a car salesman / car demonstrator, and he's really resentful of everyone and everything for reasons that we will get a lot of in a bit.
Yeah. If Jacko is the full Monty, so to speak. See what I did there? I cannot believe it's taken 4 years to make that pun, actually.
I know. Well, it's maybe because you recognized in better times, Kemper, that it was not a very good pun.
Oh, the best puns are the worst puns, of course, Catherine. Come on. Yeah, but if Jacko is the full Monty, then Mickey is the half Monty.
Right. I'll try not to unpack that.
Yes.
And so we also then have Christina Tina Argyle, who is another one of the daughters. And she's beautiful and dark and a soft-spoken librarian.
Next up, we have Hester Argyle, the youngest daughter, who is beautiful and wild, and she had wanted to be an actress, but she failed at that, and she has now come home, and she's engaging in an ongoing and long-standing flirtation with a local doctor named Donald Craig, who is a tangential character in this story, not a suspect.
Right, and then we have Kirsten Lindstrom, who is a Swedish masseuse and nurse, and all-around sort of household helper at this point. She's been with the family since 1940. I guess. She came during the war as an employee when they were essentially running a children's home for children escaping the Blitz.
She has a little bit shades of Greta Olsen from Murder on the Orient Express, who I believe in the original was Swedish.
She's like a sort of frumpy middle-aged lady.
Yes. All right, so let's get into the world as it appears to be. We do not open up on the Argyle family. We take a little bit of time to get to them. We open up on this well-known geophysicist, Arthur Calgary, who has recently returned from this expedition in Antarctica. And upon his return, while he was boxing some things up in his office, he's given some stacks of old newspapers as padding. And one of them happens to have a picture of a sensational crime trial from 2 years ago. And uh-oh is right, in a Christie. And Arthur recognizes the face of the man who was convicted in the course of that trial.
Unfortunately, it takes him a little bit to figure out why he recognizes this man, but eventually he works it out. And as he's reading about the trial, he becomes increasingly more horrified because 2 years previously, he'd been driving his way to a train station in the West Country before heading back to London. And so he picks up on this country road a hitchhiker who is the man in the photographs in the paper. And that would be the late Jack/Jacko Argyle. So Calgary drops him off in town, drops off his own car, and then promptly gets hit by a lorry. Really bad luck, Dr. Calgary has. He pulls himself up off the pavement, and he makes it onto his train to London. But when they get to London and he disembarks, he immediately collapses because, of course, he has a severe concussion. So he is brought to a hospital where he stays for several days.
Right. And upon recovery, he forces his way back onto the expedition in Antarctica. So he's gone for several years. He immediately, goes from hospital to Antarctica. So what he learns from the paper is that Jacko Argyle had insisted he had an alibi, that there was this driver who picked him up. And he did, because that was Arthur Calgary. In other words, Jacko got really unlucky because Calgary was first unconscious. Then he was in Antarctica, and he had no idea that he was needed as a witness for this alibi, and he feels absolutely awful. And he goes to Andrew Marshall, who is the family attorney for the Argyle family, and he tells him everything. And he decides that it is his moral duty to bring himself to Sunny Point, which is the Argyle's family estate, and that, he has to tell them what happened because Jacko was obviously falsely convicted.
I would like to just point out here, for no particular reason, that I love that Andrew Marshall's law firm is just called Marshall, Marshall, and Marshall.
Got to keep it in the family. I mean, it's better than Dewey, Cheatham, and Howe.
I mean, it might have been more accurate.
Might have been more accurate, or my personal favorite.
Blah, blah, blah.
Oh, for sure. All-time classic.
All-time classic.
Anyway, the family, he's expecting them to be upset, obviously, because clearly their child has died. And he's right, they are upset. But Kemper, are they really upset because a family member died?
They're upset, but not in the way that Arthur Calgary thinks they're going to be.
Poor Arthur Calgary is bewildered, to say the least. So it turns out the entire family has more or less moved on with their lives. And basically the common opinion is Jacko was an awful person and nobody liked him. And well, yes, he was their family member. If somebody has to go to jail for this, might as well have been him. So they're all moving on. They've made their peace with it, in fact, and they are all trying to get on with their lives. You know, and by the way, also, most of the people in this story heard him screaming at his mother immediately before she was murdered. So everyone pretty much assumes that the verdict was accurate.
Right. Everyone, and we are told pretty early on that everyone was in the house at the time except for Mickey and Tina. And then later on, we learn that Tina actually was in the vicinity, and it's an open question whether Mickey was too. So in effect, all those people who we mentioned were on the scene. And we'll learn more about that. But we should pause here to note what will, in fact, be the largest plot line in the story. And that is that...
By far.
Yeah, that is that all 5 of these Argyle children are adopted. They are not the biological children of Rachel and Leo because they were unable to bear children as a couple. So they adopted all of them, though it's made extremely clear that Rachel was the driving force. The first adoption was Mary, who I believe was a little bit before the war, and she had been adopted from a tenement in New York. But the other 4 were all adopted during the war when she opened her house to kids who were escaping from the Blitz, something that's well chronicled and the way into a lot of different stories as far-ranging as the Chronicles of Narnia and Ordeal by Innocence. So there you go.
Right. But instead of finding a magical wardrobe, the kids here found a very intense mother.
They did. So she considered these 5 children to be her own, and she devoted herself and her huge financial and seemingly intellectual resources towards these children. And suffice to say that perhaps only Tina is appreciative. We're not even sure if she's appreciative. She, at least on the surface, doesn't seem to be antagonistic toward her mother or have bad things to say. But the rest of the bunch seems to have been pretty willing to murder Rachel Argyle and not to have many nice things to say about her.
Right. And we should also mention here that Tina is mixed race. And boy, does it get mentioned a lot.
It sure does, and we're not going to be mentioning it again until we get to our Stuck in His Time category, but we will have a bit to say about that. Yes.
Yeah. So we also find out through all of this that all these people sort of hate themselves and each other. We find out that Philip is really resentful towards Mary. She is extremely obsessively overbearing. She doesn't like anybody else in their relationship or even getting close to him. Did you get slight hints of misery?
He didn't get out of the cock-a-doodle car!
From her relationship to Philip?
I actually thought that on the page that Philip and Mary's relationship was more nuanced than the treatment it got in any of the adaptations. I think there are shades of misery there, and he certainly does not like the fact that he's beholden to her for pretty much everything. But there is also this curiosity where he calls her Polly, even though her name is Mary. And she's kind of a cipher. She's tall and she's blonde and she's very statuesque, and she doesn't necessarily seem to pay a lot of attention to things. But then she kind of lashes out in ways that show she has this deep passion. And he seems to have this kind of appreciation for and interest in her that I did actually find to be significant. Their relationship interested me on the page because I thought that it was a little conflicted and layered and complex in a way that it never was in any of the adaptations.
I actually find Mary to be the scariest character in this book.
I do too. I think there's a lot going on there. Yeah,
it's said very early on that when Rachel Argyle, they had hit her with a car. She'd run out into the street from a tenement. and they scoop her up and bring her to the hospital, and then they insist on bringing her to like their fancy hotel in New York City, and she begs to not go back to her aunt and uncle, and so of course Rachel Argyle is more than thrilled. Except it is repeatedly said that Mary essentially doesn't have affection for anybody. Like maybe Mary is just a sociopath.
Right. She realized that these people would make her comfortable, and keep her comfortable, so she did what she needed to do. She simulated her affection.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's a little bit some of the stuff with Philip. Like she takes trays away from him so he can't like cut his own food or crack his own egg.
No, it's true. There are elements of that, but then there are also sometimes in their interactions, it's like his playfulness with her, like he is the only person who speaks to her that way, and she's bemused by him and surprised by him.
Right.
And truly interested in him in a way that she doesn't seem to be interested in anything else, like people and activities and topics of conversation or anything. So it's very curious what's going on between them.
Yeah, and also, I mean, Mary very much seems like she would be a bunny boiler if it came down to it.
I'm not going to be ignored, Dan.
Right. So we also learn that Hester is resentful. She tried to become an actress. She couldn't do that. She kind of hates everyone. She certainly hates her mother, mainly for being right.
Well, no, and in fairness, you know, when she goes and sees Hester and realizes that Hester is not a good actress, she, in fact, says, you know what, I'll pay for you to go to RADA.
Right. This is going to be a running theme in my analysis of the novel. This is one that has 3 adaptations and a really high profile one that just happened. And I think that the novel is a lot better than any of the adaptations. I actually don't think this novel has a good adaptation or one that captures a lot of the sort of character complexities that Christie manages to convey among this family. And I think Rachel Argyle, especially in all of these adaptations, she's just a shrew. She's a harridan. She's awful. Everyone hates her, and there's basically nothing good about her. There is a lot to hate about the Rachel Argyle in Christie's book, but she's complicated, and she is smart, and she is tragic, and a lot of other things. And I think that she's just a much more interesting character than perhaps she gets credit for.
Oh, for sure. And also, like, I don't think that she's intentionally horrible. I think it's made pretty clear in the book that
she's trying. Like, she just wants these children. She wants these children to love her as much as she loves them.
Loves them. Yeah.
And I mean, we could get into this a little bit now, but there's this whole notion within the book of the destructive power of possessive love. And this is something that we've seen in Christie before. We've actually seen this specifically vis-a-vis a mother and her adopted child in They Do It With Mirrors. We had that weird situation where Carrie Louise, I'm not spoiling anything having to do with the puzzle mystery, Carrie Louise had an adopted daughter and a biological daughter. And by the end of the novel, it seems as though her relationship with her biological daughter had always been a mess because she was trying so hard with her adoptive daughter. And at the end, like, her relationship with her biological daughter is mended. There's this element of, and that's the real relationship in that novel too. So this is one of those situations where we always say we want to give Christie the benefit of the doubt. And when ideas and hypotheses are coming out of characters' mouths, we shouldn't necessarily ascribe them to Christie. But I think there's a lot of textual evidence in the of that some of the ideas Christie is putting forth here are very much her ideas and ideas that seem to preoccupy her. And this notion of the possessive love of an adopted mother is something that is not coming out of a vacuum for Christie. And it takes full bloom in this book, right? And
we can get into later about the levels of problematic that is.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, that is also going to be an element of our stuck in its time category.
We'll circle back to it. You know, we can talk about the rest of the group. You know, we've said before, Gwenda and Leo seem to want to get married and now can't, right? So now they're upset. Kirsten is like this loyal member of the household, yet nobody seems to have that much affection for her. She seems to have affection for Hester, possibly, but that's about it. Mickey seemingly hates everyone with the possible exception of Tina. Tina is sort of detached a little bit from them. She doesn't like the English cold. And it seems like maybe there's something going on with her and Mickey.
Right. We'll see if that is in fact the case.
Also, it's made clear that she's the daughter of a prostitute and a sailor.
Yes. I mean, and to be fair, all of these children come from modest means, shall we say? We said Mary was in a tenement, and then this is part of the reason why Mickey hates everyone. Mickey remembers his biological mother and knows that his biological mother abandoned him.
For £100.
For £100, and that Rachel paid £100. And to give also Christie a little bit of credit, at least on the score of Mickey, by the end of the novel, he has realized the fact, or others have told him convincingly, that the person you really hated all those years was not Rachel. The person you hated was your biological mother who sold you for £100. It's not really fair that you hated Rachel. And I think we are to believe in the validity of that.
Well, because also, by the way, we're getting it originally from Tina. And I think that we're largely supposed to believe Tina tells the truth.
Yes. Again, that just goes to the complicated nature of Rachel as a person and her relationships with these children. This is not Mommy Dearest. This really isn't Mommy Dearest. You might think it was from the adaptations of this novel,
right.
but it's really not. Despite the fact that one of the children is named Christina.
Tina! Bring me the axe!
Anyway, this is an unusual Christie because it is a puzzle mystery. It's barely a puzzle mystery, but it is, but it really is one of her psychological thrillers. And we haven't really seen one. We could argue that The Hollow has lots of, elements of a psychological thriller as well, but we haven't seen it, I think, to this extent in a Christie novel yet. We've obviously seen action thrillers from her, but this is a novel that is focusing on psychology. Perhaps the other Christie novel it shares the most textual DNA with is actually Appointment with Death, which was similarly focused on psychology, and in particular the psychology of another extremely messed up family. Even the structure of Appointment with Death was similar to what we have here, in that it too was definitely a puzzle mystery, but rather less focused on the puzzle till the end of the novel. And we have the same thing here in that Ordeal by Innocence focuses on these psychological aspects of the characters, progressing more like a psychological thriller than a typical Christie mystery, functioning largely in a more linear way like one of her thrillers than her puzzle mysteries usually do. But it is also, I think, managing to be a thin puzzle mystery and one that does hang together in the end. So that's good. She's doing a lot of different things, but that's why this middle section of the book, I think we can safely skip over a lot of it. I think we've given a fairly accurate sense of what it feels like. One chapter after the next, we just have the characters internally monologuing about the various reasons why they, had so many issues with Rachel, how she wasn't really their mother, which we'll get into, how she could never be happy because she had never given birth to children. At one point, there's a doctor who theorizes that women are like cats. And that,
that was pleasant to read.
I just have to read it because it's so outrageous. Yeah, Dr. McMaster, who is like the attending doctor for the family, he says, "You've only got to look at any normal mother cat. She has her kitten and she's passionately protective of them. She'll scratch anyone who goes near them. And then in a week or so, she starts resuming her own life. And as they grow up, she cares less and less about them, and her thoughts go more and more to the attractive toms in the neighborhood. That's what you might call the normal pattern of female life. The maternal instinct in a purely physical sense is satisfied, you see. Well, with Mrs. Argyle, the maternal instinct was very strong, but the physical satisfaction of bearing a child or children never came, and so her maternal obsession never really slackened." Ack. The thing is, Christie actually puts forth almost the exact same theory in her autobiography. Janet Morgan references it. I wasn't able to pin down the section myself to quote it. I would never miss an opportunity.
I know, not ever.
Catherine. So this is another thing where, yes, you could say this is coming out of Dr. McMaster's mouth, but this is something she also explored in A Daughter is a Daughter, which was a Mary Westmacott that was originally a play. It's very much a preoccupation of that novel. So this is a Christie trope, and it's a little cringe-inducing.
A little cringe-inducing?
We don't always like to draw from Christie's own life when we're doing a textual analysis. I do understand the limits of that, but I think we would be remiss if we didn't note the fact that Christie had a very specific sort of relationship with her own daughter whereby she was absent a lot. And this sort of a theory about the destructive power of a possessive, intense love is pretty convenient if that is how you raised your daughter. It feels a little bit like she's defending her own choices. Perhaps there's an element of that as well. So that is the middle section of this book. And, Dr. Calgary, if you haven't noticed, this, we don't have a private detective. We don't even have an amateur sleuth. We really just have Dr. Calgary. I mean, he's an amateur sleuth of a sort because he feels that it's,
sort of.
Yeah. He feels that it's his moral duty to get to the bottom of this, both because he's the one who opened up this can of worms and he has this early conversation with Hester right after said can of worms has been opened, in which she says, "Don't you realize what you've done?" This is another preoccupation of Christie's, which is the suffering of the innocent whenever they have to exist within a cloud of suspicion, so long as the guilty party hasn't been named. And Hester says it's not the guilty who matter, it's the innocent. So he feels that it's his duty to this family to figure out who is guilty so that the rest of them can move on with their lives as they had already done before he ruined everything. And, that's why this novel was originally called The Innocent.
Right. And, Dr. Calgary, to the extent that he's investigating anything at all, he's not so good at it. The single biggest thing that he finds out is that Jacko was a huge ladies' man, shall we say? So he's this burgeoning, except not very intelligent criminal. And he's funding that life of crime by sweet-talking middle-aged ladies out of their money. And a whole lot of them, apparently.
At the same time, we do also have another amateur sleuth of sorts in Philip Durant. We mentioned that he's extremely smart and he's extremely bored, and he loves the chaos that Dr. Calgary has thrown upon the household, and he can't get enough of it, and he takes it upon himself to do a little bit of investigating of his own. And hijinks ensue, including the fact that at one point he accidentally, using air quotes there, kisses Hester when she falls into his wheelchair. Interesting. Of course, Mary sees that as well. A couple of other things happen. Hester finally has a meltdown when she realizes that this Dr. Craig, who she's sweet on, thinks that she actually did it. He's sort of cooling on her because this cloud of doubt, the suspicion that the innocent suffer from is very much making him nervous. And she runs off to London to see Dr. Calgary and beg for his help. And Dr. Calgary doesn't think that Hester can be responsible because they had that scene early on when she chased him down after he told everyone about Jacko's alibi, and just seems to have an air of naivete and innocence that perhaps he finds a little fetching.
Yeah, also she's really beautiful and 19.
She's one of the Irish beauties of Christie, so she's got dark hair, she's tempestuous.
But all this comes to a head when the entire family, plus Dr. Calgary, who brings Hester down, they return to Sunny Point to have a sort of denouement, except first Calgary is in town talking to Superintendent Hewish, who I suppose we should have mentioned. I know, who we should have mentioned earlier, except he basically does not have a functional role in this plot. He was the investigator on the original case, and he shows up when a police presence is needed here. So back at the house, Tina and Hester go upstairs to see Philip because he's summoned them. And at the door to the bedroom, they run into Kirsten, who is about to enter with a tea tray. She knocks on the door, and the three walk in, and they find Philip on his desk with blood seeping out of the base of his skull where he has been stabbed, and he's dead.
Reminded me of the maid in The Moving Finger who was skewered under the stairs.
Yes.
This is a really violent Christie, actually. We are not in the land of delicate poisonings here. So, as they're rushing out of Philip's rooms to get a doctor, poor Tina is increasingly feeling shell-shocked and woozy, and she rushes outside to see Mickey, whose arms she falls into, crumpling to the ground, and it becomes very clear that something is very wrong with Tina. So everyone helps her get inside, and Dr. Craig is on the scene, and he takes a look at her, and she didn't really faint. She passed out because she had been stabbed in the back, and she is immediately brought to the hospital. So we've got two very violent acts here that happen in quick succession very late in the novel. It's funny, John Curran, this is one area where I might disagree with John Curran because he generally is not a fan of the late murders in Christie novels, especially these books from the 50s where they feel like padding. And I have usually agreed with him, but I found this sequence of events to be so odd that it was, for me, a little gripping. I had forgotten that it happened this way, and I was legitimately surprised, and I didn't mind that.
No. And so we should mention that there's just like chaos. Kirsten drops the tea tray. They're all running out of the room. Everybody now is at the same place at the same time. How they didn't notice that Tina was stabbed in the back, I find a little bit confusing, but okay. Once they get her off to the hospital, the police are immediately there, of course, because she's been stabbed. And they find a small knife with her blood on it in Mickey's pocket. So they assume that she ran down from the bedroom. They ran outside. She went to go stumble towards him. And while she was hugging him, he stabbed her in the back. And also he could have killed Philip because there's like an old like magnolia tree that he could have climbed. Not looking good for Mickey.
Not looking good for Mickey. To make matters even more mysterious, Tina wakes up very briefly in the hospital, just in time to mutter, "Mickey, is she perhaps accusing him?" And the cup was empty. Cryptic phrase. And the police use this as justification that Mickey indeed is the murderer. And as we end The World as It Appears to Be, it seems like it's curtains for Mickey, except luckily we actually do have two. We managed to scrounge up two clues here.
I know.
In this crime thriller, heavy puzzle mystery light novel. I'll start on the first one. For clue number one, we can call this an egress, ingress, or perhaps even a blocking clue. So often in Christie, blocking is key. So this is a classic Christie clue here. We more often see it in books that have a lot of diagrams and doors. Black Coffee, the original Poirot play, is one where, oh boy.
So many doors. So many doors, Kemper.
So many doors. We do love that one, and that was a Patreon episode for anyone who would like to check it out. But what this all boils down to is that we shouldn't necessarily make a particular kind of assumption, in this case about direction. Assumptions are just dangerous in Christie. So when we see someone going in a certain direction, say in to a room, we shouldn't assume that they are going in. They could also potentially be coming out of that room, especially if they are just standing there. And the deduction here has to do with that cryptic statement that Tina made when she said the cup was empty. Because let's think about the blocking here of the discovery of Philip's body. We had Kirsten standing outside the door of the room that he was in, holding a tray, seemingly about to go in to give Philip Duran his coffee. Tina was standing next to her. And of course, there were cups, right? There was a coffee cup on Philip's tray, on the tray being brought into Philip. And if that coffee cup that Kirsten was about to serve Philip was empty, that would mean that Kirsten wasn't going in. She was coming out.
Right.
That would mean she'd been in the room already, and that would mean she's the murderer. This is it's one of those great Christie kind of forehead slapping clues where it feels so inevitable and so obvious when you get on the other side of it. You're like, oh, of course that's what Tina meant, and of course that implicates Kirsten, but very, very difficult to get there on one's own. The
only other clue, which you've already touched upon, is that the one thing that Calgary finds out is that Jacko's a known romancer of the middle-aged ladies. We've seen that before in Christie. She likes those pairings. And there's actually really only one, middle-aged lady in this book. And so maybe we should have been suspicious of Kirsten the whole time.
Right. I'm going to argue this is actually a rare example of Christie not doing it totally convincingly, but this is an instance where the relationship that we thought existed between two people was totally different from what it seemed to be. But yeah, perhaps the nature of the relationship between Jacko and Kirsten is very different from the way it was made to appear. All right, let's get into our resolution here. Seems like maybe Kirsten did it. I don't know, Catherine.
Just maybe.
Just maybe. Arthur Calgary does not buy Mickey's guilt, and he at this point has figured it out. So he drives himself over to Sunny Point for the denouement in the library, where he's going to reveal all, Poirot style. So basically what happens is that Calgary, having found out about Jacko's seduction of the middle-aged ladies, puts two and two together, as perhaps a supernaturally astute reader did, and realizes that points to Kirsten. And what it means is that Jacko decided that he had to murder his mother to get the money that he so desperately needed since she wouldn't give it to him. And he convinced Kirsten both to steal that money. And, we're not talking about money as in an inheritance here. We're talking about like literal cash in her drawer, right? That he needed in the moment. So he convinces Kirsten, who's in love with him, to give him the money, which is why the money is subsequently found on his person, and to kill Rachel because that's the only way she's going to get the money. And while that's going on, he stages his alibi. I mean, he makes a point to be picked up in a car by someone and to mention the time and to make sure that he has an airtight alibi. And Kirsten is just, head over heels in love with this person who she saw grow up from the age of 5, which is interesting. And she decides to go along with it.
It was a known criminal also.
I mean, I bring it up all the time, but Evil Under the Sun, the trick of character there when you're told who these people really are, and you're like, oh my God, of course, 5 little pigs. Oh my God, that's what was going on between these people. Death on the Nile. Oh, like time and time again, Christie pulls it off. I don't know if she actually pulls it off here. I mean, Kirsten would have to be a seriously, in my mind, depraved person to have helped raise this boy from the age of 5 who she knew to be as troubled as he was, and to just simply be head over heels in full-on romantic love with him to the point of doing what she did. I don't totally buy it.
No, and we don't really know enough about her. I mean, I hate to say that, but we don't really know enough about her to be at all convinced that is even logical. And also, I think he's one of the youngest of the siblings other than Hester.
Yeah. To be fair, Kirsten is a murderer, of course, so it's fair for Christie to expect us to believe that she's extremely messed up. And she also has a clever twist for explaining why Kirsten wouldn't have saved Jacko from prison after he was arrested. We haven't mentioned this yet, or the character, but it turns out that Jacko had a wife who shows up after he's been arrested. So once that happened, a devastated Kirsten was happy to see Jacko rot in jail. But even so, there's just something about the whole scenario that doesn't quite sing for me the way it usually does in Christie. It kind of goes to this whole notion that the familial relationships that existed within and among this family weren't real, which I ultimately find distasteful because they did live for decades as a family. I mean, it feels like we're just supposed to discount everything going on here because there weren't blood ties.
Right. So, okay, they let Kirsten run away, but it's clear that she's going to get caught. And it's found out that Tina will most likely survive her stabbing and she'll marry Mickey because, again, wait for it, they aren't blood siblings.
This is how we're told that at the end of the book. They've always been brother and sister, of course, but they're not really brother and sister.
Yeah.
That's like in one of the final pages. So this is sort of supposed to be a triumphant storyline for them. There's no ick factor the way that it's presented at the end of the story.
Oh, there's a big ick factor for this reader.
This reader too. I mean, there's no other way to put it that there's an element to this book that I find gross, even though I actually think, as you can probably tell, that this book is really good. I think that there's so much to speak for it in terms of the characterization that's happening with pretty much everyone except for Kirsten, unfortunately. I think it's really interesting what Christie was doing in terms of a psychological crime novel, marrying that with a puzzle mystery. But this running theme throughout of the invalidity of the Argyle family as family is bizarre, but ultimately...
ultimately, it's really offensive to anybody who is not in some sort of traditional, nuclear family relationship, because it's offensive to anybody who is in a same-sex relationship. It's offensive to people who, are divorced and remarried. That would be like saying that, your stepfather who you've known since you were 4 years old isn't your family.
We tend not to get all that personal on this podcast. And I mean, we don't have to get super personal for very long, but I have a husband and we have a child. So that means I am automatically not in this category. And it honestly was hard for me to stomach a lot of the passages of this book.
My dad was adopted, and it's not like I look at my aunts and uncles and my cousins and think they're not family members, or that somebody could just show up out of nowhere and be like, oh, I have some of your blood. Clearly we're relatives. I'm like, well, yeah, I guess that'd be interesting. I mean, I guess, you'd like to know maybe more out of curiosity, but that doesn't change the fact that my entire life is based around other people. That's your family.
That's your family. I mean, I think the most important point to make is not even that we might find it distasteful or offensive. And yes, of course, we're going to lop points off in our Stuck in His Time category for that. We'll get there. I don't think that Christie sells it because of that. I don't believe this family because she's trying to make the argument that it's not really a family. And I'm like, is that really people's experience? Because both in 1958 and now, if these people truly grew up, even with all the complications that they had from the ages of, small children to now, they would think of each other as siblings, and they would have a complicated, messed up relationship with this woman who became their mother. But in very important and crucial ways, they would think of her as their mother, and they would think of Leo as their father. And Tina and Mickey would, at the very least, be very conflicted about this. And it makes the characters less believable and less potent for me in a book where they otherwise actually really are. I mean, again, I don't want to take away from all that she's doing right in this book, because there's a lot to extol in this book.
Yeah,
it's odd. It's an odd mixed bag.
Well, and I mean, like, you can, sometimes you do to this day hear unfortunate horror stories about foster kids who get moved in and out of different homes. But, like, even when you hear stories about that, they'll still have recollections of, like, the good homes they were in and the people who they lived with at the time who were, like, the only people that they knew, And I just have a very hard time believing that all of the characters in this book, who, again, some of them are, like, under 3, that they don't have any sense at all that this is their family.
Right.
And it seems like none of them do.
We are, I think, to make the point being a tiny bit reductive. There are moments among the siblings that have some real affection in them. And the relationship that each of them has with Rachel in particular is extremely complicated. And I think we should give her due in that. It's convenient that Christie creates a character in Leo Argyle who, again, is so anodyne and so distant that his status as their father is sort of a non-issue in the book, which is bizarre.
Mm-hmm. Right. It's all,
and that also
let's blame it all on the mother.
Let's blame it all on the mother, which has its own issues. And that's just ultimately very unrealistic to me as well, where it's like you kind of just didn't want to deal with that. But if these people had all these issues with Rachel, they certainly would have had some stance as to Leo that you probably should have dealt with. But just the last point I want to make on this, because we may as well mention it now. I was going to save it for Stuck in His Time. But, in addition to that insane monologue from Dr. McMaster comparing women to cats, we also get this monologue from Leo. And again, it's in Leo's mouth, but you can feel and hear the passion that's coming behind this. He says, "It was an article of faith with her that the blood tie didn't matter, but the blood tie does matter, There's usually something in one's own children, some kink temperament, some way of feeling that you recognize and can understand without having to put into words. You haven't got that tie with children you adopt. One has no instinctive knowledge of what goes on in their minds. You judge them, of course, by yourself, by your own thoughts and feelings, but it's wise to recognize that those thoughts and feelings may be very widely divergent from theirs." And it's like, by the end of the novel, you sit there and you're like, so is the conclusion I'm supposed to draw from this that no one should adopt? It almost feels like that. And again, that's being reductive, but there's an element of that. It's sort of the through line argument of this thing is that, well, there are just so many barriers and so many problems to this unnatural situation of raising children that you didn't birth yourself. I mean, I guess you could try to do it, but oof, good luck to you. From a 21st century perspective, I suppose, this sort of argumentation has only become more ludicrous, but it's difficult to read the book and to not be sidelined and distracted by that running argument and quasi-thesis.
It also does a disservice to anybody who has a problematic relationship with their biological parents.
Right, exactly. It's like, well, you should be able to figure this out because if you have some kink temperament, and, children who are raised by their biological parents all over the world can read this and say, as can children of adoptive parents read it and say, It's just, the generalization is never a good idea when it comes to something like this. And again, to be completely fair to her, it's not as though she is generalizing. It's just a sense sense that I got as a reader, and it sounds like you did too, that there is this kind of argumentation running through the book.
It's impossible to read any other way. I'm sorry. I know that there are many readers who love this book. It's supposedly one of Christie's favorites. Although, she'd give a different title half the time she answered, right?
She would. No, it was in her autobiography, she said Crooked House and Ordeal by Innocence. I do think, to be fair to her, I think that's because of its preoccupations with themes of justice, right? The whole innocent, suffering under a cloud of guilt. I mean, this is the book, even more so than Five Little Pigs, where that theme is able to just take full flower,
Right. And we should talk about Five Little Pigs when we get to the rankings for quite a number of reasons. We should talk about it.
Yes.
But I found this book off-putting in a deep way.
I completely agree with you, and yet I didn't outright hate it by any means.
No. I didn't either. Just bad aftertaste.
Yeah. We should also mention, just to note every loose end in the book that Christie wraps up, Gwenda and Leo can, of course, now peacefully marry since the cloud has been cleared. And surprise, you know how Hester was fretting over Dr. Craig doubting her innocence all that time? Well, you know what? She's changed her tune, and guess who she's got eyes for now? Dr. Calgary.
She's like, don't you want me? And he's like, oh, do I ever? And then the book ends. Oh,
They're going to totally live happily ever after. The end.
This episode is brought to you by Best Fiends.
Believe it or not, the holiday season is upon us, Catherine. Time stops for no man and no fiend.
'Tis true, Kemper.
Which means
that we have a season of good cheer in which to enjoy even more Best Fiends. Yes, I was definitely thinking that too.
What will Howie the Lizard do for the holidays? Will there be another costume change in his future?
We could hope that there is, and I suspect that there will be, since Best Fiends is constantly updating their game, not only with new designs, but with new puzzles too.
You make a really good point. So this holiday season, engage your brain with fun puzzles and collect tons of cute characters. Trust me, with over 100 million downloads, this 5-star rated mobile puzzle game is a must play. Download Best Fiends free on the Apple App Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R, Best Fiends. All right, well, let's segue over into a discussion of the adaptations before we talk about the rankings. We have 3 adaptations of this novel, actually. The first was released in 1985 by Canon Films. This is the studio that released Texas Chainsaw Massacre 2. And as our good friend Mark Aldridge puts it in his book, Agatha Christie on Screen, I'll be cribbing a lot from him here. They also produced the infamously under-budgeted Superman 4, which was a personal favorite of mine when I was a kid. But probably more relevantly, this was the same company who did the 1988 Appointment with Death that starred Peter Ustinov, and also the 1989 10 Little Indians with Frank Stallone. That would be Sly's brother.
Obviously the best one.
That gem. Yep. So we kind of know what we're dealing with here.
Just gold.
Cinematic gold. So the movie stars Donald Sutherland as Arthur Calgary. It also stars a criminally underused Faye Dunaway as Rachel Argyle.
Tina! Bring me the axe!
As well as Christopher Plummer as Leo Argyle. Really great cast. Christopher Plummer is so young in this that he still looks more like Captain Von Trapp than the rather adorable older gentleman that he would later become. I just appreciated that. Maybe want to watch The Sound of Music.
Captain Von Trapp.
Oh, Captain, my Captain. So there's a really nice quote from Matthew Pritchard in Mark's book about Donald Sutherland getting along really well with Rosalind and her second husband, Anthony Hicks. I just think some people will appreciate it. It kind of doesn't have anything to do with anything, but it's really charming. Here goes. He was brilliant with my parents and used to take them out for dinner almost every night at a brilliant restaurant in Dartmouth called the Carved Angel. And Donald said to my stepfather, who loved his wine, "Right, Anthony, you can organize the wine and I'll organize the food." By the time he left, there was no wine left in the Carved Angel. And at the end, my stepfather said, "Don't you mind how much this is costing?" "Oh, forget it," he said. "It'll just go on the budget." They had a marvelous time. He was really charming to them and had no reason to be, really. So, I love that. Donald Sutherland whining and dining with Rosalind and Anthony Hicks each night of this shoot.
I mean, I like it.
Also, just of note, the film was shot in Dartmouth, as you could tell from that reference to the restaurant, in Devon, very close to Christie's holiday home of Greenway. And probably the best part of this movie is the setting. It's beautiful. I mean, it's beautifully shot, and there is some sort of beautiful mise en scène that's done, especially in the beginning. Like, there's this great opening sequence where Donald Sutherland is coming to Sunny Point by boat on a river, just as he does in the novel. And that is very much the River Dart that he's on. I mean, the river that flows right past Greenway. So that's cool. The one thing that we do have to talk about with this movie and what it is infamous for is its score. The score is just bonkers. So right off the bat, it is busy and springy and jazzy. And it's like, are we about to watch
It's Dave Brubeck, right?
It's Dave Brubeck. It's like, are we about to watch a moody murder mystery? Okay, why am I listening to jaunty jazz right now?
I'll just like to note to everybody that, as you might know from our opening, my last name is Brobeck. And also, I unfortunately played jazz flute for a little bit in high school. So if you don't think that I have an unfortunate number of Dave Brubeck references behind me.
Wow. Yeah, it's actually really interesting how that happened. I'm, of course, also getting this from Mark, but apparently the film kept on testing really badly with audiences. And I'm quoting here, this panicked the studio, and the decision was made that a fundamental change was needed. At this point, the film had been fully scored by Italian composer Pino Donaggio, who had apparently worked on a previous Donald Sutherland movie. And that score still exists. It's very reminiscent of a ghost story with creeping, understated unease, because this is a very dark, brooding adaptation of the novel, appropriately so. That score would have made sense, but unfortunately the studio just decided to scrap it, and they turned to jazz musician Dave Brubeck, who very hurriedly, he apparently didn't even have time to compose a new score for the movie, and you can tell he just took bits and pieces of other things that he had composed, and it just doesn't work. There's this seething jazz number that eventually boils over as Arthur Calgary is imagining Jacko being hanged. That is just one of the most intrusive moments in a score that I've ever experienced watching any film. It really takes you out of the movie. That's kind of indicative, I think, of this movie as well. I mean, it has really good actors in it. They generally stick pretty close to the plot. Kirsten did do it. They do make the curious choice to reveal her as the killer 2/3 of the way through the movie, even though we get a very traditional denouement. I remember that from watching it when I was a kid. It's a very, very bizarre choice. So it's very dark and heavy, but I think it's easy to mistake that heaviness for high quality. It just doesn't quite come together. So it's a bit of a missed opportunity. That's my take on it. That's that one. Then we go all the way to 2007 before we hit our next adaptation. And that would be the ITV Agatha Christie's Marple adaptation starring Geraldine McEwen. We're in season 3, episode 2. I am not normally a fan of when they shoehorn Miss Marple into these novels. Here, the way they do it is that Gwenda Vaughn is one of Miss Marple's former maids from the orphanage, and she invites her to her wedding that she's going to have with Leo Argyle. And then, this is 2 years after everything that went down with Jacko and Rachel. It's honestly not a bad way in. We have Jane Seymour as Rachel Argyle, the hideous Rachel Argyle in this one. Dennis Lawson is Leo Argyle. I'm a fan of his as a character actor. Gugu Mbitha Raw actually plays Tina, and Alison Steadman is Kirsten. Also, Jacko was played by Bern Gorman, who's another really good character actor. He played Blore, actually, in the Sarah Phelps and Then There Were None, and he's just been in a ton of stuff. He has one of those faces you just immediately recognize. Right. A great villainous face. In this version, Gwenda actually gets killed instead of Philip Durant. It's very violent, and I was very surprised by it. I have to say, this was one of my better experiences watching, in particular, a Geraldine McEwen, Agatha Christie's Marple episode. It is by no means perfect either. I've already said this. I don't think that this novel has a good adaptation, but I am going to take a stand and say that I think this adaptation may come closest.
Yeah, which is a bizarre thing that I don't feel like either you or I would ever have thought we would say during one of these podcasts.
I know. I wouldn't not recommend watching it if you haven't watched it already. everybody.
High praise.
High praise. Just worth mentioning, there is a French language adaptation, Les Petites Meurtres d'Agatha Christie. That was just for you, Catherine. Je vous en prie. So that one aired in 2009 in the first season of that series. Apparently, it featured a murder by way of a fork stuck in someone's throat. Sacré! We also have a BBC Radio 4 adaptation that aired in 2014. The only thing I will note about that is that Hester was voiced by, wait for it, Phoebe Waller-Bridge.
That is very exciting.
Right? That is kind of exciting. It brings a whole other angle to Hester.
I can kind of see Hester as Fleabag.
She's got a little bit of Fleabag in her.
Yeah, she does.
It's true.
For sure.
It's true. All right. So then we come to the adaptation that most people probably think of when this novel is mentioned because it's pretty recent. And that is the BBC 3-episode miniseries that was done in 2018. It was adapted by Sarah Phelps, who has a lot of fans and a lot of detractors. We've talked a lot about Sarah Phelps adaptations before. She has a number of these BBC licenses under her belt now. I will always stand behind her witness for the prosecution. I think there's a lot of good things to be said about her version of And Then There Were None, even though it's not perfect. Our Patreon subscribers actually know that we have a lot of thoughts about her ABC Murders adaptation with John Malkovich's Poirot. That was the very first Patreon episode we did, in fact.
Although actually, again, has some things to recommend that, I think.
It does. I mean, this is what I will say as a way of transitioning into my pan.
Of softening the blow that you're about to give?
Yeah, of this adaptation. I always knew what she was going for in the ABC Murders adaptation. I didn't always like it, but I understood what she was doing.
I think in a lot of ways, the ABC Murders adaptation works really well. The problem that I would have with it is that the book is still Hastings involved, and it still has some lightness to cut through the depravity of the plot, and the adaptation removes all of it.
Right. The adaptation goes hardcore on the depravity, but, you know, she's making points about xenophobia. I didn't love everything she did, but I understood it and I respected it too, actually. And I still, even with this adaptation, what I will always respect is the seriousness and the care with which these novels are adapted, because even this incomprehensible adaptation of Ordeal by Innocence, I think, was made with care. It just did not work for me in any way whatsoever.
Well, okay, so we should mention from the outset that part of the reason this is going to be really well known is because of its incredibly troubled production history.
Right.
So before you launch into your pan, Kemper, we should also mention that a good chunk of this movie was refilmed.
Yeah, it was reshot.
And that had to do with a potential sexual assault case.
Ed Westwick is the actor who had to be cut out of the movie due to some allegations against him. And he had been playing Mickey Argyle. So they brought in another actor to play Mickey. And they did a lot of reshoots, as they would have to do. I mean, there's a lot of ensemble scenes in this movie. Obviously, it's about a family. Or is it? But Alice Eve plays Gwenda Vaughn. And she was apparently in the States by the time they had to do the reshoots, and she was just like, I cannot be there. So she had to get split screened in, and there is some awkwardness with her. There's some awkwardness in terms of like the time of year, and it couldn't have helped. So let's be a little bit forgiving on that front. But funnily enough, I mean, I think the look of the movie, and for the most part, even the acting performances, that's not where my problem lies. My problem really lies with the basic adaptation itself. The changes from
it just goes bonkers in like a weird way. I mean, just in a way where you don't really expect.
Yeah, well, I would argue that it's bonkers almost from the beginning, because what Sarah Phelps decided to do was to do a whole lot of flashing back. So this series is so disjointed. But yes, you're right. It does go off the rails spectacularly. I think it's actually really helpful to reference something that Anthony Horowitz said in our interview with him. I hope you all checked that out, because he adapted a lot of Poirot short stories and novels in the course of the Agatha Christie's Poirot series. And he said something that I found really interesting, which was that he liked doing the short stories more because he was able to play around with them more and alter them more. But even with that, there were two things they could never change: the means of the murder and the identity of the murderer. They could never mess around with whodunit. And I think that makes so much sense because that's so fundamental. That's so central to what people value and appreciate when they're coming to these adaptations. And even if they haven't read the source material, it's a way of anchoring the adaptation to the source material, but then it still allows you to do so much more in so many different things. So to me, that really makes sense. And I think that if you're going to alter whodunit, you have to have a really good reason for why you're going to do that. And as many know, spoiler alert, but Sarah Phelps changes whodunit in her adaptation. It is not Kirsten. It is Leo Argyle.
Well, not only that, but like the various means of murders here also don't bear any resemblance really to...
That's the thing. Not only does she change whodunit, but she changes the means of murder. Like she changes the fabric of the murder itself because obviously, you know, in the original, we had this kind of hidden relationship, right? It was a relationship between a middle-aged woman and a young man that we didn't really know existed. And in Sarah Phelps' version, that has been changed to the fact that Kirsten is actually the biological mother of Jacko. Interestingly, that is something that Christie herself toyed around with in her notebooks. John Curran does make note of that. She had some alternate ideas for what she could do with these characters. One was that Kirsten would be Jacko's biological mother, and another was that Rachel Argyle would actually be Jacko's biological mother, even though she had been putting herself out as not, which, you know, doesn't really make sense in the final iteration of the novel, but it is at least an interesting idea as she was toying around with it.
I do have to say, at some level, Kirsten being his biological mother makes more sense than what's actually in the book.
It 100% does. And I mean, we haven't talked about it yet. I was going to save it for the rankings, but I might as well mention right here, this novel, Ordeal by Innocence, is extremely similar to a short story we already covered called Sing a Song of Sixpence. And John Curran makes note of it, of course, because he always does. And I'm just going to quote him. He always puts it best. Although the story first appeared in December 1929, almost 30 years earlier, the parallels to Ordeal by Innocence are too many to be mere coincidence. The outsider detective, the elderly matriarch bludgeoned to death for money, the gnawing suspicion and distrust, the eventual disclosure of an unsuspected emotional and criminal partnership. And in that short story, the connection between the older woman and the person who actually did the crime was mother and son. That was the hidden relationship. And it really could make a lot of sense in Christie's version, but that's not actually the reason for the murder in Sarah Phelps's version of this story.
No, and on top of it, we get our sort of faux detective also put in a really odd position in this adaptation because it turns out he's a mental patient.
Right. It turns out that Arthur Calgary is lying about being on an Antarctic expedition. He's actually been in an insane asylum, because of course he has. And he gets recommitted to that insane asylum at the end of the series because he knows too much, and the evil Leo Argyle wants to lock him away. And the reason why Leo Argyle actually killed his wife is that she found him having an affair with Gwenda, which is borne out by the text. But in Phelps's version, she was going to cut him off. She was going to divorce him and cut him off. So he killed her, and he framed his own son for the murder. And when I say own son, in this version, Jacko is his biological son with Kirsten. So he frames his biological son, Jacko. The character name is actually Jack in this version, not Jacko. And
his name, in fairness, is Jack in the book, too. It's just that everybody calls him Jacko.
They always call him Jacko. In any case, he also colludes with the chief of police, who is angry at Jack because he's been carrying on an affair with his wife. There's also the weird implication that maybe the chief of police is gay, and that's why his wife was carrying on an affair, because she wasn't being fulfilled. There's a very unpleasant scene that involves Jack forcibly kissing him and stuffing his finger in his mouth. We know we're in a Sarah Phelps adaptation here. I say that with love. I say it with a modicum of love. Yeah, so they conspire to have him killed in prison. They make it look like he was in a fight, and that is the conspiracy. And Arthur Calgary figures it out, and Leo has him committed, but his other children are onto him, and they figure it out. And it's not clear at the end of the series who knows about this outside of Kirsten, but we end on this just bizarro of all bizarro sequences in which Kirsten has apparently secreted Leo in an underground nuclear bomb shelter. which we've seen Rachel sort of cower in at several points throughout the story since she's such an unhappy person. And she seems to just maybe be burying him alive there, like Cask of Amontillado style. It's unclear. Like, is she going to let him starve to death? Is she going to kill him? Is she going to torture him? We don't know. She's sort of humming to herself at the end. And that's it. That's what we end on.
We should also note that there's an extortion plot that happens too.
And there's also all of these Baroque kind of grotesque additions to the horrible things that Rachel does. The worst by far being that when Hester runs away, she actually has an affair with a man and gets pregnant. And Rachel finds her, drugs her, brings her to a doctor, and forcibly has the doctor perform an abortion on Hester without Hester's consent.
Here is the biggest thing that I would say about this is the book doesn't really have a puzzle mystery, and it actually has an incredibly straightforward plot. You know, take away all the psychological stuff about the characters. The actual plot of the book is very straightforward.
Mm-hmm.
This adaptation has the least straightforward plot I could possibly imagine. Because the plot of Ordeal by Innocence, Christie's book, is the guy who did it really did do it.
Right.
You know,
which is again, I mean, it's what's so brilliant about it is that's what she did from her first book onward. She did it so many times and she found all of these variations on that same theme. It's the double bluff. I mean, we had it in Mysterious Affair of Styles. You think that the most obvious person did it, then you're shown that they couldn't have done it, and then they did it. And she manages to do it in a fresh way in this book. And that's the brilliance of this book. And other parts of it are problematic. And it's as though Sarah Phelps went out of her way to enhance and elevate the problematic aspects of it and bury the part of it that works.
Right. Because the thing that works about it is, again, that double bluff and the fact that it's exceedingly simple. Baroque is the best word to describe the adaptation.
And we described the ABC Murderers adaptation that way too, but again, there was at least a purpose for it. She was portraying a lot of hatred toward Poirot and a lot of pain and a lot of suffering and this darkness. And I don't understand what we really get from Rachel drugging Hester and having an abortion performed on her without her consent.
Well, yes, other than the fact that she's apparently this sort of villainous hell creature, nightmare mother, which, again, as we have now talked about at length, is literally not there in the book. It does not exist in the book.
It's not there in the book. To give Phelps some credit, you know, there are sequences in the series where Rachel breaks down. In that bomb shelter, for example, there's this one scene where she's crying her eyes out on the bed and Kirsten gets on the bed with her and is like hugging her. We can see that she's a broken, troubled person. She's not just a cartoon monster. But she has her moments where she is a cartoon monster, and it doesn't really add anything to my understanding or I think the overall complexity or depth of the characters. It's not helpful, especially given all the extra plot complications that have been added. The overall effect is one of bewilderment. I hate being the naysayer as to plot alterations. It's so predictable. I don't want to be the diehard fan of the text who's just like, you changed. I mean, I have so much of that in me that I'm actually very careful about not turning into that sort of a viewer. And I've made this point so many times before. I think that where Christie is concerned, especially, it's actually important to do something different when you're adapting her because she's been adapted so many times over. Right. So what's the point unless you're doing something different? And we bring up that French language series, which we also did an episode on in our Patreon. Apparently we're going to mention every single one of our Patreon episodes in this episode, but they take such liberties with the texts in those episodes, but you can tell that they get it and that they're mining it for the things that work in it and having fun with it in a cooperative way. It's just not what's happening in this adaptation anyway. I'm not going to paint a wide brush about all of the Sarah Phelps adaptations by any means, but this one is just not working.
The sad thing is you get Bill Nighy, you get Anna Chancellor, you have Alice Eve, you have the lovely Ella Purnell and the lovely Eleanor Tomlinson, and you have my beloved Matthew Good.
Yeah, Matthew Good as Philip Durant is great. And yeah, Bill Nighy as Leo Argyle. Anna Chancellor, I adore her in everything she does. She plays the hideous Rachel. I have no problems with the actors or the acting performances in this adaptation or even the look or the feel of it. It's all as to story.
Well, on that note, speaking of story, we should dive into rankings and talk about plot. Because here's the thing. Pretty high on both mechanics and credibility, I think.
Yeah, I have a little bit of a bifurcation here, but I think we've at this point talked through our feelings on plot, so we don't have to say all that much. All I would like to do is quote our good friend John Curran as to his final verdict on the novel, because I know people like hearing from him. I certainly do. And he says that Ordeal by Innocence remains one of the best of the latter-day Christies. It is a crime novel, as distinct from a classical detective story, with deeply held convictions about truth and justice, guilt and innocence.
What are you feeling?
For plot mechanics, I'm feeling an 8, actually, just because I actually think this is similar to how we felt about The Hollow. You know, The Hollow was not really a puzzle mystery. It was more of a psychologically focused sort of crime thriller, if you will. And I think that she's doing a lot of the same things here and mainly doing them very successfully. I think we'll dock some points elsewhere, but this is not the category in which to dock any.
Yeah, no, I'm with you.
Okay. So I'm actually a little lower, though, on plot credibility, and I haven't brought up the one big hole that I find with this plot. Believe it or not, I haven't brought it up yet. I've been saving it for right now. Here's my one issue, Catherine. I'm very curious to see if you agree. Wouldn't Jacko have admitted to the whole thing when his alibi didn't pan out?
That he had actually convinced Kirsten to do it.
Because it's an open question whether or not he'd get a lesser sentence if he was convicted for aiding and abetting murder or being an accessory to murder. That's truly what his crime is here, even though he is morally culpable, of course. And I suppose if we're giving Christie as much credit as absolutely possible, we can assume that Jacko did tell his lawyer, Andrew Marshall, I guess, of Marshall and Marshall, or whoever his barrister ended up being. Perhaps he did tell that person what Kirsten did, and the lawyer decided it didn't matter or wasn't worth pursuing. But I find it hard to believe that that would actually be the lawyer's advice. And I also find it hard to believe that Jacko wouldn't have told anyone and everyone who would listen about what Kirsten did as soon as he realized that Kirsten had turned against him. We've been told that Jacko is an opportunist. He has no moral compass. He doesn't care who he hurts. And this is where I'm going to bring up Five Little Pigs, because there are so many parallels to be drawn between these two novels, right? First of all, we have the whole idea of a murder in retrospect. Yeah. So, you know, this is a murder that happened 2 years ago. In Five Little Pigs, we have a murder that happened 16 years ago. In Five Little Pigs, Christie figures out an airtight reason why the person who was convicted unfairly for the crime did not speak out. She accounts for that beautifully and movingly. It's one of the best elements of the novel, right? Why Caroline Crail does not speak out. It makes it
almost perfect because it is so completely tragic and it makes absolute sense.
It makes absolute sense. It adds texture to the character dynamics that are at play. But here, there's no similar reason. I refuse to believe that Jacko would, after his alibi fell through and Arthur Calgary never appeared, I refuse to believe that he is sitting in jail through his arraignment, through his trial.
And that he never throws an j'accuse towards Kirsten?
Towards Kirsten. Why wouldn't he? Of course he would. But the reason why Christie can't have him do that is because obviously that would spoil the book. That's a problem.
Yeah.
The ITV Marble series actually got around it by saying that Jacko was in serious trouble with some criminal types, so that if he had gotten out of jail, he would have been killed anyway. And then they even have him say something. By
the way, it is implied in the book, because it's implied that he's only so desperate to have come back because he's going to prison regardless.
But is he going to go to prison for the rest of his life?
No.
In the ITV version, they have him say something cryptic about doing something right for the first time in his life, which does not ring true to the character. But they actually do account for the Kirsten thing. And then interestingly, in the Phelps adaptation, he dies very quickly in prison. But that loose end doesn't need to be tied since Kirsten didn't do it. So yeah, it's a problem. It's not like the House of Cards all falls apart. I think you can argue your way out of it. Well, he was maybe going to go to prison anyway. Here's what I would do. It knocks credibility down a bit for me. I was going to say a 5. I think that's still actually a bit low, because overall I think that the plot score should be very high for this book, but I'm thinking a 5 or a 6.
So I can do a 6. I probably am going to have a lower opinion on characters than you will.
All right, well, fair enough. Let's slot in a 6 for that. So obviously for characters, we need to just count book-specific characters twice since we don't have any series-long characters in here. I've said this a bunch of times. I think that the adaptations do such a disservice to the characters. I think Rachel is a fascinating character and a complicated character. And she's a very similar character to Caroline Crail in Five Little Pigs because we never actually meet her, right? It's just people piecing together different memories of her. So we're never actually presented with Rachel Argyle, and I think that's really significant. All of the mother love, possessive, adoptive mother stuff is troubling, but it doesn't take away from the complexity of her character.
The difference would be that where in Five Little Pigs, we get a very distinct image of Amyas Crail. We don't really get that with Jacko.
I agree with that to a certain extent. Yes, the counterpart for Amyas is definitely Jacko. He is yet another Monty character. As I said, he's the full Monty. He's not as masterfully drawn as Amyas is, or as memorably drawn. I agree with that. But I do think that here, too, it's very difficult for him to shine on the screen as he does on the page. It's a little similar to when we were watching the adaptation of Taken at the Flood, and we were saying how David Hunter in the book has this kind of brittle charm to him that is actually very attractive on the page, but it just was not there on the screen. That's how I felt about all the portrayals of Jacko/Jack. And I do think that Christie pulls him off to a certain extent in the book. I totally agree with you, not to the level of Five Little Pigs.
No, and also, even with the Caroline Crail comparison, I think you know exactly who Caroline Crail is. Like, I think you walk away from that book knowing exactly who she was and who she was to the people around her. Whereas I think Rachel Argyle, you know, you're left with some weird ambiguity about what's going on there.
Yes. Listen, I'm not going to be arguing that this book should be ranked anywhere near Five Little Pigs. I don't think you are either. And that is one of the many reasons for that. So fair enough.
So of the other characters, I mean, you know, you kind of end up with Hester as like one of the leads, I suppose. She gets a lot of page time. I don't think she's a very good character.
I disagree with that. I think she's an interesting character also because I think she's this extremely attractive, sympathetic, yet ultimately weak character. And I have one quote from her that I think encapsulates what Christie's doing with her. This is what she says. It's Hester herself speaking. "I wasn't anybody. I was fluid." Yes, that's the word, said Hester. It's exactly the word. Fluid. Never taking a shape for long, just trying on shapes of other people that I admired. And even at the end of the book, she doesn't seem to be sure of the fact that Arthur Calgary even wants her. And it's like she sort of offers herself to him, and he's like, yes, I'll take you. But there's not a lot of strength behind her. I think she's a weak character, but a weak character is not necessarily a poorly drawn character. To a certain extent, she had almost a more quote unquote normal antagonistic relationship with Rachel. And she's the one who says, in a couple of years, I think we would have been good friends. I think that I would have figured out how to conduct myself with her. And this is really, really extrapolating. But I actually couldn't help thinking, as she was saying that, of Rosalind. Actually, I'm not saying that Christie was creating Hester in the mold of Rosalind, even though it's perhaps worth noting that Rosalind was a quarter Irish, and Christie commented at least once in her writings about how Rosalind's quote-unquote Irish blood influenced her personality. But, you know, to a certain extent, a lot of the issues that Christie and Rosalind seemed to have went away, or at least were softened when they were both in adulthood, and they really grew to have a true appreciation for each other and a friendship with each other that they did not have when she was a child. I don't know. I think there's actually a lot to mine in the Hester relationship. I think you just don't really like her, and I don't either, but I don't think she's poorly drawn.
Okay. Well, agree to disagree. We already went through Mary at great length.
I think all of these characters, even perhaps Tina, although it's just really hard with Tina because of all the othering that's going on with her, which we'll get to in a moment. I think they all are much more interesting when you take a moment to pay attention to what Christie is doing with them on the page. Where do you come out on characters?
I mean, I probably would have gone like 7.
Perfect. Me too. So 7 twice. See, we're not off at all, Catherine. We never are.
I know, it's true. It really is true. Like, we get into these like long extended arguments, and then it turns out we actually have exactly the same opinion.
Yeah, exactly.
So setting in town, I think that it's very well written. I know that we've often thrown that into the tone category. And so I think it gets extremely high points for that. Setting, I don't feel so strongly about. The estate is very nondescript.
Although we do get a little bit of a sense of Greenway in the setting from time to time. I mean, it's nothing like in Five Little Pigs or Dead Man's Folly, but like
it's apparently also new build, or pre-war new build. So it doesn't actually have the history of it. I mean, that's part of the reason the library is the sort of central place in the house where we see the characters, because it's the only place that seems lived in. And I actually think the description of the library is quite nice when we first get in there, that it feels lived in. It has floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, there are papers scattered on the tables, etc. I think it's sort of worn upholstery. I think is quite nice.
Yeah, I appreciated the scene setting she does, which kind of evokes Greenway when she writes, they walked round to the back of the house and started down a zigzag path through trees, which led finally to the beach on the river below. Halfway down, there was a small summer house sheltered from the wind. They did not at once sit down, but stood in front of it, gazing out over the river. That's Greenway. And also the ferry that, Arthur Calgary uses in the opening. That's the one that still runs to this day. John Curran talks about this actually at the end of Greenway Road, just past the gates of Dame Agatha's summer residence. So a soupçon of Greenway in this one, at least a solid setting for her. And I agree with you. I think this book is really readable. It has a very different feel to it. I would never call it a breezy read, but I think it's an easy read, even though it has a curiously airless quality to it. A little bit similar to like Crooked House. Like, that is not necessarily a condemnation to say that it feels airless. It just has a different feel to it.
A little stifling.
Yeah, intentionally so. And, I do just also appreciate all of these themes that we know Christie loves to play with, just like really being brought out here, and I think discussed so intelligently. The whole moral justice versus legal justice thing. She really, really gets at the notion that essentially Arthur Calgary just did nothing good here. I mean, Jacko was just as morally culpable as Kirsten, and even though he is dead and was convicted of the crime that he didn't commit, he's guilty. And I think that's also just fascinating and worth noting within the context of the Christie of. I've mentioned this before, I think probably on our Five Little Pigs episode, but for someone who wrote as many murder mysteries as she did, she very rarely went to the wrong man has been convicted of a crime which most authors go to a lot. And I think part of that is that she did have a basic fundamental faith in the justice system, or at least didn't want to appear as though she didn't, even though legal justice and moral justice don't always line up. And it's just interesting that in the two best examples, the two most shining examples, Caroline Crail, for her own reasons, does not help herself, and that results in her own conviction. And Jacko, even though he is falsely convicted, is morally guilty. And also, in a lot of these adaptations, both Caroline and Jacko are hanged for their crime, and Christie never does that. And I think that it's a little bit of an impulse toward just, she doesn't like the idea that within the British legal justice system that these people could have been wrongfully executed, and they never are. They just die in prison, and it's sad and it's bad, but it's not a wrongful execution. I think that's so important for her. And I think that makes sense. And they kind of even die in the same time frames. Caroline Crail is not imprisoned for very long. Right. I know it's like they suffer a little bit, but they die pretty quickly, and not at the direct hand of the legal system, although, couldn't have helped, I'm sure, being in prison. I think
so we're going with like an 8 for setting and tone.
I think an 8 makes a lot of sense because this is very strong. And then let's just talk a little bit about Stuck in Its Time. We've been over a lot of this before.
We've been through all of the stuff with the adoption problems and the bloodline stuff. I mean, we've been over that at length. We don't have to relitigate
that.
it here. No.
The only thing I do want to go over is the references vis-a-vis Tina. We just haven't pulled them out, but she's constantly referred to as a half-caste child, quote unquote. There are just a couple of references to her, many of which seem to focus on her appearance and just to be a bit dismissive of her as a person, on an equal footing with all the other characters in the story. Here's one. Her skin was darker than an English skin could ever be. Her bones, too, were smaller. This was the half-caste child that Mrs. Argyle had taken as a daughter into the family. But the worst one comes out of Philip's mouth, actually. And to be fair, Philip is a blunt sort of a speaker. He has, caustic way of speaking, but he says, Tina's always the dark horse to my mind. Perhaps it's the half of her that isn't white. Who was the father, do you know? And then Leo responds to him, he was a seaman of some kind, I believe, possibly a Lascar. The mother, added Leo dryly, was unable to say. And yeah, I had to look up what a Lascar was. It's a very imprecise and I'm sure due to that imprecision, somewhat offensive and racist term for a sailor from anywhere east of the Cape of Good Hope who worked on a European ship. So honestly, we're not even sure what ethnicity Tina is. It's all very vague, just that she's not white. And that is just harped on a lot.
Yeah, it really is. And it's not cool.
No. So I think those two issues together add up to 3 demerits in the stuck in its time category. Do you agree with that, Catherine?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay. All right, so it is time now to add up our scores here for Ordeal by Innocence. We've got 8 plus 6 plus 7 plus 7 plus 8 minus 3 for a grand total of 33 points, putting Ordeal by Innocence in a big old tie, but I think in the right part of our rankings grid. So we have a number of titles tied for 33 points. I'm going to read them out for you, Catherine.
Okay.
Carol at End House, Cards on the Table, The ABC Murders, After the Funeral, Sad Cypress, and Towards Zero. And these range from 10th to 15th place on our grid. I think it makes a lot of sense that this novel is falling that high because this is an important Christie, a notable Christie, especially in the latter half of the Of. I'm not going to lie. I think I would have predicted that it would have fallen a little higher before I reread it, but I don't think it deserves to be any higher than among those titles. That feels like the right place for it.
Yeah, agreed.
I feel pretty strongly that it should be below Peril at End House, Cards on the Table, and the ABC Murders. Do you agree with that?
For sure.
I'm less sure as to where it should fall when it comes to After the Funeral, Sad Cypress, and Towards Zero. I actually feel pretty strongly that it should be above Towards Zero. I'm very unsure as to After the Funeral and Sad Cypress. How do you feel?
I know. I'm torn. I'm very torn about that. We can put it above them. We can always recalibrate the next time we do the rankings. It might go down a little bit, actually.
I think it should probably go above them, too. We love both of those novels, and there's a lot that we love about this novel, but, Sad Cypress has such major flaws, and it feels like I think it should go above After the Funeral, so I agree. That puts Ordeal by Innocence in 13th place out of 50 titles. This is our true 50th title of Christie. That means we only have 16 left. All right, well, that is Ordeal by Innocence. So our next episode, as I mentioned at the top of this episode, is going to be our interview with Tana French. Very excited for that one, Catherine. Very excited. And I'd also like to make a note that, if anybody hasn't, we did an interview with Anthony Horowitz recently as well. And also you can check out our previous interviews for the International Agatha Christie Festival on their YouTube channel. Unfortunately, they're not on our podcast channel. But yeah, interviews aplenty, Camper. In the meantime, we would love to hear from you, as we always do. Let us know how you felt about Ordeal by Innocence. You can contact us via email at allaboutthedame@gmail.com. We should say, by the way, thank you for everyone who has responded with their Stuck in Its Time statements. We have not forgotten about you, and we indeed have gotten enough of them that we will be putting out a special episode on that topic, something that we just discussed at great length in this episode, something to look forward to in the coming weeks. And you can, of course, always go to our Patreon site if you haven't gotten enough of us. We are at www.patreon.com/allaboutagatha. You can find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find Catherine on Twitter at Brobcat. Our Instagram handle is at allaboutagatha, and our Facebook page is All About Agatha. Take a moment to rate and review us if you haven't already. We so appreciate it, especially because it helps other people find the podcast. And we'll see you next time. Bye.
Bye.